What if something was hidden deep inside your home, not something alive, but something that had been screaming in silence for years? A doll, not meant to be played with, but meant to bury the truth. In this story, an innocent-looking toy pulled from an old chimney didn't just carry dust, it unearthed a forgotten truth that once shattered an entire village. The question is, if you uncovered a secret like that, would you bury it again, or let the world finally hear what it had to say? It was one of those unsettlingly warm September afternoons in Elmridge Hollow, where the air, though golden and sweet, seemed to hum with an invisible tension, like a held breath stretched too long. The roses along the broken west wall of Miss Agatha Renly's garden bloomed stubbornly in the fading light, their petals tinged with the bruises of a long summer, drooping with a tired elegance that whispered of forgotten promises. Miss Renly, precise and solitary in her lavender cardigan and scuffed gardening shoes, moved quietly between the bushes, trimming dead heads with a calm that masked the keenness of her gaze, eyes that had once caught the smallest tremor in a liar's smile, and still held the clarity of a mind unclouded by age. Behind the clipped hedges, the village breathed the distant clinking of crockery from the tea room, the faint jingle of a harness on the milk cart, children's laughter echoing faintly like echoes from a dream, but beneath it all there was something off-kilter, a shift, a silence tucked behind the sounds, as if the village itself was listening. That morning, for the first time in over 2 decades, the faded blue shutters of Thornbury Cottage were open, allowing the sharp autumn light to seep into the dust-heavy rooms like a long-banished ghost. The house had stood empty since the Ashburn tragedy, untouched, unloved, and largely unspoken of. But now, it had a new tenant. Evelyn Carr, young too composed, with clipped London vowels that felt learned rather than born. Her arrival had been quiet, just a lone black cab that pulled up at dawn, one battered trunk, a satchel of old books, and eyes that never quite met yours for long. She greeted the locals with careful warmth, polite smiles, and a distance that wasn't quite shyness, but calculation. The villagers noticed, of course, they always did, but said little. Yet even silence in Elmridge was heavy with judgment. On the 3rd day, a pair of chimney masons from Bell and Weather came to clear out the flue, their ladders clanging against old brick like an unwanted awakening. They worked quickly until one of them paused, called down in a tone not quite right. He had found something, not a bird's nest, nor soot-hardened stone, but a porcelain doll, no taller than a child's forearm, entombed in ash and filth. Its skin was smudged black, but its face, once wiped, revealed glass eyes of jarring clarity, blue and bright, unblinking. The doll's gown, singed and dulled by time, still bore the faint imprint of roses embroidered in pink silk thread. And the scent, a strange acrid mix of smoke, lavender and something coppery, lingered as though it refused to forget. Evelyn gave a faint laugh when handed the doll, claiming perhaps a child had hidden it decades ago. But her fingers trembled slightly, and her eyes lingered too long on its face before she wrapped it in linen, and placed it on the mantel, as though sealing a pact she hadn't agreed to. But in Elmridge, word spreads like fire in dry wheat. By sundown, whispers had already reached the vicarage and post office, trailing in the wake of Widow Grail's hushed tones. That house remembers, you know. Not everything burns away. And then came the tea at the vicar's garden, a genteel gathering of aged smiles and weak sponge cake. Evelyn, perhaps a tempting charm, brought the doll along with a teasing comment, setting it beside the marmalade tarts like an eccentric trinket. The moment Martha Dorsley, once midwife, now the church's linen keeper, saw it, her expression collapsed into something raw and primal. She froze, the color draining from her as if something inside her soul had cracked open. Her teacup fell and shattered, her voice broke into a whisper, one word, Ashburn, before her knees buckled and she crumpled to the ground. The room exploded in motion, cries for cold cloths, windows thrown open, someone fumbling for smelling salts. But even when revived, Martha's eyes wouldn't leave the doll. They darted back to it like a prisoner watching their jailer. Miss Renly, still seated, still composed, watched all this unfold with a steady, unreadable expression. She had known the Ashburn name. She had known what had happened in Thornbury Cottage, and she knew, with an old certainty that trembled deep in her bones, that the past never stayed buried, not in Elmridge. It lingered in soot, in whispers, in dolls that stared too long, and in the eyes of strangers who arrived knowing too much. Late September was fading, draining the last hues from the sky above Dunley Cross, and beneath that grey-washed canopy, every house seemed steeped in the damp scent of old memories, from the shuttered windows of Sycamore Parsonage to the moss-soft grass behind the war memorial. Everything looked like it wanted to speak, but chose silence instead, the kind of silence that feels bred for screaming. That afternoon, Miss Edith Hollings had spoken only once, her voice barely more than a strained whisper, mistaken by most for the muttering of dreams. She shouldn't have come back, but Maud Litchfield, whose eyes often stared at the ground, yet saw far beyond it, caught those words as if they'd snagged on something sharp in the air, something wrong and lingering. By dusk, Edith was found motionless in her chair, her eyes wide, fixed on some unknown doorway, as if an old shadow had brushed her just before the end. And when Dr. Willoughby pronounced it heart failure, it wasn't the trembling in his hands but the flicker of doubt in his gaze that made Maud pause. The next day, Mrs. Liscombe hosted tea, one of those formal gatherings where everything appeared perfectly in place, but felt terribly off. The sponge cake was too sweet, the sandwiches had no crusts, and the conversation unfolded like mist before rain, until someone mentioned Briar Hollow, and the room seemed to shrink beneath an invisible chill. A doll, behind the hearth, said Rowena Blair, referring to one whose glazed eyes, beneath a fine web of cracks, still held something aged and unreadable. Preserved, someone asked. Concealed, Constance Vale answered, a cold word that lodged itself quietly and deeply. That night, Maud wandered the village paths like a ghost herself, passing corners that wore old memories like curtains, until she stood before Briar Hollow, now reopened, alive again without welcome or invitation. The doll, with a porcelain face cracked precisely where a smile might have lived, wore a ribbon around its throat, tied not as an adornment, but a warning. Edith had known something, Maud felt, and that knowledge had cost her life. In the church, after evensong, as the final hymn faded into the stones, Maud overheard Evelyn and June Withers near the altar rail, whispering, "She's come back." "Mira Langley," said June, "the daughter of Briar Hollow, and of everything that came with it." The name Isabel Granger floated back like a bitter taste, the girl who vanished one day after the war, leaving no note, no trace, only a burned scarf at the edge of her bed. They said she'd gone to London, but Maud always knew London was just a convenient lie. The real story never made it past the village lips. The doll that had now resurfaced was Isabel's, and when Mira touched it, it wasn't possession but recognition, like it was telling her something, reminding her of something long buried. That night, Maud stood before Briar Hollow, and glimpsed candlelight flickering inside, and a slip of paper, a name written upon it, one that never appeared on the war memorial. Mira Langley, her hair still pinned the way someone once gently told her to, now lived in the very house where the last scream had been heard. And Maud, who had no fear of memories that crawled through sewage-dark channels, understood this wasn't merely a doll, it was a witness. In Dunley Cross, not all memories are buried beneath flowers, some continue to smolder beneath hearthstones never shedding light, only waiting for someone to return, and when they do, the past is no longer content to stay silent. The fog had rolled in by late afternoon, thick and slow, swallowing the jagged boundaries of Alder Grange like a long-forgotten guilt returning home. The house stood hunched at the end of the lane, its chimney leaning as though eavesdropping on every secret still breathing between the walls. No birds had circled its roof in days, not since the letter arrived, brittle parchment, sealed in blood-red wax, postmarked from a village that hadn't been marked on any map since 1881. Florence Halbridge hadn't spoken a word since she opened it. She just sat there in her ancient nursing chair, unmoving, fingers trembling as they traced the embroidered edge of a shawl nobody could recall ever seeing before, a shawl stained faintly with something darker than tea. She stared into the cold hearth as though something within was watching her back. He found the name, she whispered once, barely audible, her eyes glinting with the wet gleam of a memory too dangerous to recall aloud. That same night, Eleanora Dray, young, curious, and tragically unaware of Morven Hollow's unwritten rules, followed her missing cat into the root cellar of the old vicarage, thinking only of fur and whiskers, not ghosts and graves. But what she found instead, hidden behind a rotted wine rack, and a veil of cobwebs thick as lace, was an oilskin pouch sealed with wax that had cracked like old bone. Inside were 3 items: a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, a child's drawing of a crooked house beneath a black sun bleeding ink, and a single strand of coarse copper-colored hair tied in a sailor's knot, too long to belong to any child, and far too wild to have ever belonged to Florence. The air in the cellar chilled, and the candle flickered blue. By morning, the chapel bell tolled once, not for worship, but for warning. No one had rung it. Mrs. Albridge, the widow who hadn't left her cottage in 9 winters, was seen barefoot in the dew, standing beneath the churchyard yew tree, wearing her brother's military coat and muttering, "She's back. The one they buried without a name, the one we tried to forget." Doors closed early that day. Curtains were drawn. The butcher closed at noon without a word. The crows, black-eyed and silent, returned to the chapel steeple and perched in rows, as though summoned by something older than hunger. That evening, Eleanora found herself drawn to Alder Grange, not out of curiosity, but something heavier, like duty, or destiny disguised as instinct. The door was open, but Florence was gone. No sign of struggle, just her shawl folded neatly on the hearthstone, and the window pane above the nursing chair cracked inward, as though something had pushed from within. A note, written in precise slanted handwriting, lay beside the extinguished candle. "The girl knows the house knows her name." Eleanora read it twice, then turned to leave, but paused. A faint humming filled the air, not from the walls, from beneath the floorboards. That night, she dreamt of a staircase spiraling underground, each step etched with words in reverse Latin, each wall lined with portraits whose eyes had been scratched out violently. At the base of the stairs, a wooden door with her name carved backward, deep and jagged, as though clawed rather than carved. When she reached for the handle in her dream, she woke. Her hands were dirty, nails filled with soil. Her shoes by the door were caked in wet mud. But she hadn't left her bed, had she? Across the village, in the dead hush before dawn, a music box began to play on its own from beneath the chapel floor. A slow, hollow lullaby, one no living soul remembered teaching their children. The ground beneath the cemetery shifted softly, as if exhaling, and somewhere deep beneath Morven Hollow, where history had been buried not with grace but with fear, something stirred, something that had waited patiently for the last blood-bound child to return, for the last lock to crack open, and for its name, hidden so long, to be spoken aloud one final time. She never spoke much of where she'd come from, only that the winters there were the kind that didn't just bite, they remembered you. The wind would slide through the stone walls like an old rumor returning to finish what it started. She never said the name of the place aloud, but once, just once, I found a faded inscription inside the spine of Pilgrim's Psalms, tucked into a false pocket of her sewing kit. "Clara Renlow, do not forget." The ink was browned with age, the kind of writing you don't just stumble upon, you inherit it. I showed it to Miss Ainsley, whose silence was more knowing than surprised. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she traced the name. "Some names," she whispered, "aren't lost, they're waiting for grief to grow brave enough to remember them." I didn't know what she meant, not then, but something in me had already started listening. Wren Hollow wasn't on any official map, just a curve in the road shadowed by overgrown willows, but it called to me like I'd forgotten something important there. In my mother's old trunk, beneath carefully folded linens and a hollowed-out book of nursery rhymes, I found a battered tin box wrapped in violet silk. Inside was a lease, April 1942, deeded to Clara Renlow, and scrawled beneath in barely legible graphite, "Not to be sold, bound by trust, no burial, no return." The handwriting, I recognized instantly, the same elegant script from the birthday cards my mother wrote me before her illness clouded her mind. There was also a photograph, torn, stained. Two women standing before a wild rose-covered cottage. One was my mother, the other, her face was obscured, but the curve of her jaw, and the tilt of her head matched mine exactly. The historian, Mrs. Harrow, paled when I showed it to her. "That's Rose Hollow Cottage," she said, clutching the image with trembling hands. "It's been sealed since the Renlow incident." She didn't elaborate, only that in 43, something unspeakable happened, and the local priest had burned the records, but not before someone tried to preserve a truth. In the vicarage attic, Mrs. Harrow found a scrap from an old parish registry, November 1943. Renlow. Entry withheld. Correspondence silenced. Infant unnamed. No christening. No burial. Not married. Not mourned. I took the paper home and left it on the windowsill. That night the roses bloomed. Thick red petals against dry winter branches. It hadn't bloomed in decades. The villagers said the land had gone dead, that no birds sang there. But when I stood in the cottage garden at dusk, I heard soft humming, a lullaby I hadn't heard since I was a child. When I returned to my room, Pilgrim's Psalms had fallen from the shelf and lay open to a page I'd never read before. The margins were inked in fresh handwriting. "The house remembers. The name remembers. Blood never forgets. She waits by the chimney, still crying." I didn't sleep that night. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and just before dawn I heard footsteps above me. In the attic no one had entered in 50 years. The scent of violets, smoke and something iron filled the room. And on the mirror, drawn in fog, was a single word. "Daughter." I turned, heart frozen, and saw the photograph lying on the floor. Now whole, now clear. And both women were staring out from it. And both had my eyes. Elmsmere had always been quiet. Unnaturally quiet. Like every smile in the village hid a scream that no one dared acknowledge. When the old clocks struck midnight with their creaking ticks, or when the sand near the centuries-old church swirled with the wind, villagers would quietly lock their doors like an old wound had stirred again. The darkest, most buried scar in Elmsmere's history was the Briarwood schoolhouse, a place consumed by fire in 1948, though its smoke still seemed to linger in people's memories like a scent no one could wash away. Miss Elspeth Dorr, now 94, was the last living witness to the day Isabel Langley vanished. Isabel, a girl whose voice seemed made of wind and light, who made the very walls of Briarwood come alive when she sang. But one day, she disappeared without sound, without trace, leaving behind only a few scorched pages, and on them, scribbled in trembling ink, she refused the ritual. When Clara Penwell, the village's new schoolteacher, met Elspeth, she thought it was just an old ghost story. But that changed the day Clara discovered a sealed box in the church's dusty vestry desk, buried in dirt, sealed with wax, and inside it a diary. The ink inside had bled into the pages, words were warped and twisted, but one name appeared over and over again, Isabel. And below it, barely legible, were the words signs appeared after the hymn. "Do not wake them. Nightfall is listening." Clara dismissed it at first, some cruel prank or relic of overactive imaginations. But that night, as she looked out her bedroom window, she saw a girl, a small figure standing silently at the gates of the ruined schoolhouse. Grey pinafore, white ribbons, eyes that looked, paused like time had frozen within them. The next day, when Clara told Mrs. Holloway, the baker's widow, what she'd seen, the woman fell eerily silent and whispered, "Let the sleepers, not every voice is meant to be answered." Disturbed, Clara sought out Mr. Finch, the school's former caretaker, now a gaunt, hollow man who barely looked above the ground. He only said, Isabel heard something from beneath the chapel, like an ancient tongue, not love, not prayer, but calling. When she refused, they hid her. But fire doesn't bury everything. After that day, Clara began hearing a bell each night, a bell that hadn't tolled since 1948. And one evening, under a pale, cloudless moon, when the world felt dried out and breathless, Clara found herself standing in the ruins of Briarwood. Beneath the shattered bell tower, Half buried in the earth, she discovered a leather satchel, uncorrupted by fire or time, as if it had been placed there only yesterday. Inside was a single note, small and yellowed, that read, "Do not remember her, or you will become her." And just then, the wind let out a cold whisper behind her, a faint scratching sound, like small fingers brushing against stone. Clara turned slowly, but there was nothing there. Only the scent of burning lavender lingered in the air. And then, faintly, a young girl's voice reached her ears, nervous, aching. "I'm here. You came too, didn't you, Clara?" That night, the briarwood bell began to toll, deep, haunted, trembling with a sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. A sound only heard by those who have lost something, or by those who are about to cross into a place from which they may never return. When the wind shifted in Thornbrook, it didn't just stir the leaves or rattle the old shutters, it awakened something long buried, something that tasted of dried lilacs, rusted prayers, and the bitter sting of unfinished lullabies. The villagers said nothing, but they all felt it, the heaviness that crept into the marrow of their bones, the hush that fell unnaturally just before twilight. Edith Harrow, caretaker of the Thornbrook Chapel for over 4 decades, noticed it first, not in any grand fashion, but in quiet disturbances. The vestry clock stalling always at 3:17, her aging cat growling at empty corners, and the parish ledger flipping its own pages in the dead of night. She confided only once, and only in passing, to Miss Adeline Greaves, the quiet governess with a steel spine, known more for her silence than her speech, and whose eyes often lingered on things others couldn't see. "It's not the thing itself," Miss Greaves whispered as she stitched crimson thread through a patchwork of morning colors, "but its shadow. And shadows, remember, when the long dormant estate of Sir Felix Rawley reopened due to a clause tied to the disappearance of his only son Benedict, 3 decades earlier, Miss Greaves was summoned, not for sentiment, but because she had once tutored the boy, and was the last to see him, the night he vanished beneath a moon that refused to shine. The solicitor, Mr. Halbridge, a man whose presence was as brittle as the ledger he carried, handed her a parcel, retrieved from a concealed panel behind the Rawley Library's fireplace, a decaying leather-bound book marked only with the letter R, and a small brass key wrapped tightly in a child's handkerchief embroidered with the name Alaric. The ledger inside listed names, hundreds, maybe more, written in increasingly erratic script, as though the author had realized too late what they were chronicling. One name was circled in wax-red ink, Alaric, no surname, no dates, just a name sealed like a curse. When the key was tested, it opened a trunk in the forgotten attic, a place no one dared go, filled with remnants of an eerie childhood, a velvet blindfold, dust-covered wooden soldiers, and an old phonograph with a cracked cylinder already in place. It played silence at first, but at precisely 4 minutes and 37 seconds, a boy's voice whispered through the static, breathless and trembling. "I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did. And now it's inside." That night, Miss Greaves awoke shivering. Though no windows were open, the mirror on her vanity was fogged over, not from breath but from within, and drawn in the mist was a child's scrawl, "Find the hymn." The next morning, the vicar's wife found every hymnal in the music cupboard missing, save one, placed purposefully at the center, its cover damp and curling, with a torn-out page hidden inside. On it, a note dated 1901 read, "The melody stirs them. Do not play it at dusk. Do not hum it near mirrors, and never, ever, alone." Panic, though unspoken, spread like frost. Doors were barred before the sun dipped, windows stayed shuttered even on cloudless days, and no one dared mention the boy who once spoke to shadows, the boy who vanished without a cry. Determined, Miss Greaves returned to the chapel, alone, at midnight, the cursed ledger under one arm, her breath a visible prayer. As the bell struck 12, though the chapel's bell had not chimed since its tower crumbled in 1893, the stained glass windows flickered with a faint, pulsing glow, And at the far end, bathed in moonlight that pierced where no roof existed, stood the boy, barefoot, pale, and impossibly still, his eyes reflecting wind and fire. He raised a single finger pointing to the altar. Beneath it, her hand trembling, she pried open a warped floorboard, revealing another key, this one oddly warm like it remembered touch, and a final fragile letter, the ink faded but legible. "Forgive me, I sang the hymn. I let it in, and now it waits behind every mirror, every melody. It wants a voice." As she finished reading, the organ behind her began to groan to life, though no one played, and from the unseen gallery above came the echo of a child's laughter, high and lilting, followed by a whisper like leaves dragged across stone. "You came back, Adeline. Will you sing it with me this time?" No one in Elmbrook could say precisely when the humming began, only that by the third evening, it no longer sounded like a song but a memory unraveling in real time, a trembling, fractured sound that rose from the forest behind Penlow House, a place long deemed cursed, where vines had swallowed the gates and the chimney wept black streaks down stone. It was Eleanor Marsh who first heard it clearly, standing in her pantry with the kettle hissing and the walls breathing too slowly, a soft childlike hum, drifting from the direction of the Penlow ruins, though no footsteps marked the dew outside. Mrs. Thistlewick, whose hands never stopped shaking after the war, muttered from her porch, "That house always owed someone something." Then came the strange disturbances, dolls turning to face windows they once ignored, the old town bell in the tower, that hadn't chimed since 1967 ringing twice in the hour before dawn, the sound sharp and hollow as if echoing through water. In the vicarage, frames slid gently off walls without shattering. At the schoolhouse, chalk scribbled without touch, a child's looping hand forming the same phrase on every board. "She's coming" when the third verse starts. On the fifth day, a postman refused to deliver near Penlow after hearing laughter under his wheels. No children were in sight, but a single marionette dangled from the iron gatepost, its strings tangled around an old war medal and a lock of red hair. Later that evening, Eleanor found a letter slid beneath her floorboards. No stamp, no date, only her full name written with a precision that made her hands go cold. Inside, a corroded thimble, a baby tooth, and a brittle note that read, "You promised not to sing it, Ellie. Why did you lie?" She buried it in the stove, but the next morning, the thimble was back on her pillow, warmer than it should have been. The town grew tense, unnerved not by what was said but what wasn't. Doors locked early, windows covered in black cloth, as though to keep something in rather than out. Miss Langridge, the school mistress who once taught the Penlow twins, returned from retirement, pale and shaking, speaking only to say, "The third verse was never meant for human tongues. It bends the soul like wet paper." When the Penlow crypt was discovered unlocked, its iron seal twisted open despite decades of rust, Constable Bellamy fainted at the entrance, later mumbling about candlelight seen flickering underground, and the faint echo of weeping that didn't match any voice living. That night, Eleanor, sleepwalking or summoned, could not say, found herself standing barefoot on the Penlow lawn, staring at the nursery window. The doll once buried with her twin sister stood in the sill, its head cocked slightly, arms outstretched, its glass eyes painted freshly, lips now stitched with fine gold thread. Behind her, the music box she'd buried as a child, sealed with wax and gilt, played two broken notes over and over without touch. The sky above Elmbrook held no stars that night, only a low breath of clouds and a silence so thick it swallowed crickets. And then, from the attic of her childhood home, a voice, high, breathy, trembling, "Ellie, you left the door open." By dawn, Eleanor's home was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry, no trace of her but a shallow impression in the attic dust, a trail of copper hair leading to the eaves, and a final line etched onto her mirror in fog from within. "Forgiveness is not silence, it sings even buried." Thoughts didn't linger on the shattered cupboard, or even the framed photo that had been turned silently face down. No, what troubled Eliza Harrow, what rooted itself in her marrow like cold iron, was the absence of chaos where there should have been some. No smashed locks, no scattered books, no forced entry, Just one thing gone, her sister's velvet doll, the one they'd both sworn never to touch again. It had vanished from its locked glass case in the upstairs hall, untouched for over 3 decades, its head slightly tilted as if always listening. The case itself remained sealed. No cracks, no dust disturbed, just a lingering scent of lavender and mothballs, and something else, something wet. The air in the house had shifted since that night, thicker, slower, as if the walls were watching. The parlor's ticking clock had stopped precisely at 3:17, the exact minute. Eliza realized that Martha's drowning had been reported all those years ago, the day they'd found her bonnet caught in the brambles near the well. Her small hands never recovered. That well, long sealed and covered in ivy, had started seeping again. Black water, thin as thread, now traced faint lines across the flagstones. And then there was the knock, soft, deliberate, at the nursery door Eliza hadn't opened since 1969. Behind it the sound of humming, a lullaby no one else remembered. Sleep my love, beneath the tree, the root remembers what the leaf can't see. Then came the envelope, no return address, wax sealed with a sigil, a broken crescent around a weeping eye, a symbol Eliza hadn't seen since her days at Red Hollow, the boarding house where the sisters were once sent and from which Martha had returned. Different. Inside was a single line written in faded crimson. You buried me with silence, now I return with sound. That night, the cellar door creaked open of its own accord for the first time in years. Not blown by wind, the air was still. Below, beneath the brittle wooden stairs, lay 2 small shoes, soaked and muddy, with a tiny ribbon wrapped tightly around the left one. Martha's old habit. And above, in the attic, all the family portraits had begun to shift on their own. One, in particular, a photo Eliza always avoided, now lay beside her pillow. 2 girls in lace dresses, hands clasped, and a dark third figure standing faintly behind them, undefined but watching. No one spoke of these things in the village. They'd called Martha's death a tragedy, Eliza's retreat from society a consequence of grief. But now, one by one, subtle signs began appearing. Birds crashing against the windows, soot falling from cold chimneys, and Clara Langdon's journal, discovered open on her garden bench, where her final entry read only, "She's waking up." When Clara didn't return for tea the next morning, Eliza already knew. Her boots were later found placed together by the edge of the orchard well, her red scarf coiled around them like a serpent. The coroner said stroke. The villagers murmured bad luck. But Eliza, she no longer believed in luck. She knew that some memories weren't memories at all. They were seeds. And now, after decades buried beneath denial, they had begun to grow, to crack the foundations of the house, the mind, the soul. She lit every candle she owned and tore away the nursery wallpaper, searching desperately for the lullaby's final line, the one Martha never finished. Beneath 5 layers of plaster, her fingernails bleeding, she found it, scrawled in a child's trembling hand. Say her name and set her free, or she will come for you and me. Outside the wind stilled and the dolls in the glass cabinet turned their heads as one. The mirror fogged though there was no heat. And Eliza, clutching the worn bonnet she'd once hidden in shame, whispered her sister's name. Upstairs, the lullaby resumed, this time with a third voice humming along. The envelope had no postmark, no address, no name, only a faint scent of dust and lavender that hadn't graced Greyhaven Cottage in decades. Eleanor Gray hesitated before picking it up from the parlor windowsill, where the breeze couldn't possibly have left it, yet there it was, folded with almost ceremonial precision, sealed with dark wax imprinted by a symbol she didn't recognize. A downward-facing iron key threaded through the eye of a raven, wings outstretched as if caught mid-shriek. Her fingertips tingled as she broke the seal. Inside, a scrap of parchment, its edges browned with age, bore a single jarring sentence scrawled in jagged ink. She was never buried. You looked in the ground, but she went up. The words gnawed at her memory until a half-forgotten room whispered back. The attic, locked since 1952, after her great-aunt Miriam had vanished, following what the family described in hollow tones as a fever and a drowning. though no river search had yielded a body, and no death certificate had ever surfaced. No photographs of Miriam remained, only a shadow in the corner of one family portrait, her face turned just enough to blur, as if even then she was already beginning to disappear. That night, heart pounding like an old church bell, Eleanor climbed the creaking stairs, each step shrieking beneath her weight as though resisting. The attic door, once nailed shut by her grandfather, was ajar. Inside, the air was too still, like the breath had been taken out of the room decades ago, and never returned. A rocking chair sat at the center, moving gently despite no draft. Behind it, on the sloped beam wall, she saw a message, the same words from the note, written in mirror script with some dark substance that flaked when touched, possibly soot or blood. Around the chair lay a perfect circle of old toys, their eyes gouged or painted shut, all turned inward. In the center, a scorched ring marked the floorboards, like something had burned slowly in the shape of a cradle. Trembling, Eleanor reached for a cloth bundle tucked beneath a beam. It was a doll, matted hair, mouth stitched closed with gray thread, and its dress fashioned from what looked like the torn hem of a christening gown. Pinned to its chest was another message, faded but still legible. She didn't drown. She sang. Overcome, Eleanor staggered back, nearly knocking over a wooden crate filled with old hymnals. The next day, disturbed but driven, she walked to the decaying rectory archive where she found the groundskeeper, an elderly man with hands that shook when shown the doll. I was there, he whispered. There was a service, yes, but no coffin, no priest. Just an organ playing itself. And the bell wouldn't stop. When asked who attended, he said only no one came inside. Just watched from the fog. They said it wasn't proper to mourn her. Later, in the hidden compartment of the hearth, accessed only by pushing back the brass fireguard she'd never questioned, Eleanor uncovered the family Bible. Its spine cracked, its pages brittle. One verse had been underlined in what looked like charcoal. For the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. Below it, a name, Miriam, once written in soft cursive, now scratched out violently. A tremor passed through Eleanor. Miriam had not died. She had been silenced, erased, possibly confined within the very house that now groaned at night. She returned to the attic once more, this time, armed with a mirror. Holding it to the wall, she read the message again. Bring her down. That night, all the mirrors in the house fogged over simultaneously, except the one in Miriam's old room. Eleanor stood before it, and saw her own reflection, only it didn't mimic her. It tilted its head first, then lifted a hand, then mouthed a single word she somehow heard in her bones. Remember. And as she stood frozen, the attic above her creaked, not from settling wood, but as if someone or something was pacing, waiting to be acknowledged. The past, Eleanor now knew, doesn't sleep. It lingers in wood grain, whispers through the pipes, waits behind mirrors, and leaves breadcrumbs in the shape of dolls, verses, and childhood songs no one taught you. And when truth is hidden long enough, it doesn't fade, it becomes louder, it becomes desperate, and then, it begins to call you by name. The house had remained untouched for years, not forgotten, not forsaken, just paused, suspended in time like a breath held too long. Hawthorn Hollow stood at the edge of the woods, where fog clung low to the ground, and ivy crawled up its bones as though nature herself were trying to hold the past within. The villagers crossed themselves when they passed its gates. They didn't speak of it directly, only in murmurs, as though the house itself had ears. Children were warned never to approach, not for fear of what was inside, but for what might remember them. Inside, the wallpaper had peeled back like curling skin. The mirrors were veiled with dust that had settled like ash, and yet, the furniture remained exactly where it had been decades ago, as if someone might return at any moment, or had never truly left. The fireplace in the drawing room, tall, ornate, blackened with age, had not been lit since the day Evelyn Bly vanished in the autumn of 1948. She was just 7. The storm that night had shattered windows, knocked out power across the countryside, and by morning, Evelyn was gone. No footprints, no trace, just a doll, on the hearth, and a faint smell of smoke that lingered longer than it should have. The house had been locked ever since, its story buried beneath whispers and bricked-up records, until Charlotte Vale arrived, a quiet woman, with a historian's discipline, and an archivist's curiosity. She had no known link to the house. The town's preservation committee had contracted her to catalogue its contents before demolition. It should have been routine, but from the moment she crossed the threshold, the air changed. Dense, thick, almost sentient. Floorboards creaked beneath her step, as if reacting to her presence. The first night, she thought she heard soft humming, like a lullaby, from the nursery upstairs. Though the door was nailed shut from the outside, it began with small things. Clocks that had long stopped began ticking faintly when she passed. A mirror in the hallway showed a faint handprint, small and childlike, that faded when she tried to clean it. Then, in the soot of the drawing-room chimney, she discovered a tin box, warped with heat, hidden in a cavity behind the bricks. Inside was a bundle, wrapped in waxed linen, a page from a journal scorched at the edges, a child's ribbon stiff with time, and a porcelain doll, its lashes blackened, one eye slightly askew, and its ceramic hand still clutching a note faded to near invisibility. The message read. She sang to the fire. It listened. Charlotte, normally rational, felt an unease settle into her bones. Something wasn't right. She dug deeper. Behind a warped floorboard in the nursery she found more fragments of charcoal drawings, disturbing crude sketches of a girl and a shadowed figure with twisted arms and hollow eyes. The same figure appeared again and again, always near the fire. In one drawing, flames seemed to have mouths, but the most unsettling discovery came from the ledger she unearthed in the parlor's hidden cabinet, the old rector's birth registry. Among its brittle pages was a single entry: female infant, no name given. Mother, C. Vale. Father, unknown. Baptism denied. Charlotte froze. The surname was hers. Her mother had never spoken of her past. Only once, in a moment of rare vulnerability, had she said, "I wasn't meant to be kept." That had made no sense at the time. Now it did. The pieces aligned with terrifying precision. Charlotte wasn't just a historian assigned to the Hollow. She had been called here, not by coincidence but by blood. She was Evelyn's sister. One had vanished. The other had been removed, silenced, and placed far away from whatever haunted that place. And now, unknowingly, she had returned. That evening, Charlotte placed the doll back onto the hearth. The moment it touched the stone, the air shifted. A coldness crept into the room. The fire, long dead, sputtered once, then bloomed into life without flint or match. Within its flickering glow, shadows danced unnaturally. And in the flame, for just a breath of a moment, Charlotte saw a figure, small, delicate, unmoving, with her back turned and her head bowed, as though waiting to be remembered. She whispered, "Evelyn." The fire dimmed instantly. The air grew so still it hurt to breathe. The doll, once dull, now reflected the flame's light in its eyes that shimmered faintly, as though awakened. Charlotte didn't scream. She understood. This was not horror. This was remembrance. Some truths are not uncovered. They are returned when blood remembers its roots, and silence grows too heavy to bear. Evelyn had not been forgotten. She had waited, in ash, in brick, in fire, and her sister had finally come home. She placed the porcelain figure gently on the aged lace runner, a figure far too fragile for the weight of its memory, far too mute for the horrors it had witnessed. Though small, it radiated something strange, as if its painted glass eyes had absorbed the echoes of screams long buried within the crumbling stone walls of Rosemore Hall. Outside, the storm deepened, snow sweeping the windows in thick, swirling patterns, like time trying to bury truth once again. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over her teacup, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on the doll that now sat like a witness, finally brought back to the courtroom of memory. Across from her, Inspector Callan leaned forward, the flickering firelight casting shadows beneath his tired eyes. His silence said more than words could. At the head of the long dim table, Margaret Linton, once merely a village archivist, and now a reluctant executioner of old truths, sat with her hands folded neatly, as if trying to contain the tremors of what she was about to unleash. Her voice, low but resonant, broke the silence like a blade through silk. You always wondered, didn't you, why your mother, Clarissa, never spoke of your early years, why you dreamed of staircases you never climbed, why a cottage you never visited felt like a room half remembered from some other life. Eleanor's throat constricted. She could barely nod, because she wasn't your birth mother. Margaret continued, her eyes unreadable. The woman who bore you was Adelaide Everleigh, and she gave birth to you in this house, during a winter thick with scandal, shadows, and silence. Eleanor recoiled slightly, the name hitting her like a forgotten lullaby sung in a nightmare. They said she died, she whispered. They said it was an illness. Margaret pulled out a worn telegram, its edges curled with time. That was the lie. The truth is, she was declared unfit by her own brother, Sir Reginald, a rising political star, who couldn't afford a scandal, an illegitimate child, born of a servant girl promoted to mistress, a will rewritten in your favor. None of it could reach the surface, so he had her committed. And you, spirited away through forged documents and whispered arrangements. Inspector Callan spoke then, his voice hoarse. A nursemaid vanished the night after the birth. A doctor paid off. A solicitor, my own predecessor, tasked with making the paper trail disappear. But Adelaide's final letter, it survived. He withdrew a folded page. Its ink faded but its anguish still alive. Eleanor reached for it with shaking hands. She called you Amara, Margaret added quietly, and she never stopped asking for you, until they silenced her. Eleanor's world tilted. The doll on the table, once dismissed as a child's toy, seemed to lean toward her, as if recognizing the blood it once watched over. You weren't supposed to return, Margaret said, but blood remembers. Memory lives in marrow, and the house it never forgets. The wind howled through the rafters, and in the distant hallway, a door creaked open with no hand near it. Callan continued. The recent break-in, it wasn't theft, it was erasure. Reginald tried to retrieve the doll, to destroy the last physical link between you and this house, between you and the woman they erased. Margaret nodded. But you didn't come back for revenge. You came seeking answers, and because you did, the silence ends tonight. Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest. My name, she breathed. It was hers. It is yours. Margaret affirmed. Not borrowed, not hidden, restored. The fire popped sharply, as if in agreement. Callan stared into the flames. We thought silence was safer, he said, but silence feeds rot, and rot spreads. No one spoke. The shadows along the wallpaper seemed to listen, breathing, stretching like the house was waking up after a long haunted sleep. Eleanor looked once more at the doll. It no longer looked like porcelain. It looked like a child's last witness, now avenged. A moment later, a slow rustle of fabric and boots echoed in the hallway. Another visitor, or another memory returning to its place. Rosemore Hall wasn't empty anymore. It was full of echoes, of truths, of the names they tried to bury. And Eleanor, or Amara, or both, sat tall and still at the table, no longer uncertain of who she was, but knowing this, the past had called her home for a reason, and it would not let her leave until every lie had paid its toll in truth. The fog had begun to roll in before sundown, clinging to the crooked hedgerows and crumbling dry stone walls that bordered the village like the bones of an old sentinel too weary to guard its secrets anymore. Eliza stood at the rusted gate of Bramblewick House, its hinges shrieking in protest as she closed it behind her one last time. The sound thin and distant, swallowed quickly by the mist, as though the air itself was eager to forget. The doll in her arms, once brittle with soot and silence, now rested gently against her chest, its once torn seams stitched delicately with lavender thread, the same shade her mother used to mend handkerchiefs during long winters that smelled of coal and cough syrup. Eliza hadn't come back for answers, not at first, only for sleep. But dreams have their own gravity, and hers had begun pulling at her in ways she could no longer ignore. They started weeks ago, half-lit corridors, Footsteps behind her on attic stairs, and a low lullaby sung by a voice that trembled with both love and regret. No lyrics, just the melody. Always the same. The kind that lingered long after waking. She remembered the sound of it when she stepped off the bus at St. Endelian's Hollow, a place small enough not to appear on most maps, but large enough to house sins generations deep. The driver hadn't even needed directions. "Back again, miss?" he asked, glancing at her suitcase, then the doll. "Looks like someone's still waiting." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The village had barely changed. The same cobbled lanes warped by roots and rain. The same ivy-cloaked cottages with lace curtains drawn tight as secrets. But the people, their eyes tracked her with a silence far louder than words, and every smile came a second too late. Even the air felt cautious, as if it feared what might rise if it breathed too deeply. At the bakery, Mrs. Whitcomb paused, kneading dough mid-motion when Eliza mentioned her aunt's name, Meredith Ainsley, her hands tightening instinctively as though the very syllables carried weight. "Thought she'd no family left," the woman murmured, barely audible over the crackle of the wood-fired oven. "Thought she died childless." But the photograph Eliza carried told a different story. A younger Meredith, smiling, weary-eyed, and unmistakably holding a small child on her lap, a child with Eliza's eyes. She found Bramblewick House cloaked in ivy and shadow, every window blind shut, as though the house itself was ashamed to see daylight. Inside, time had softened the edges of everything. Dust lay thick like snow across the banisters. The fireplace still held the faint perfume of old ash. But it was the nursery that pulled her, the one room she had never seen, always locked during her childhood visits, always whispered about. It was here she found the doll, buried not in a trunk or under floorboards, but behind the chimney itself, walled in like something cursed. The plaster gave way too easily, almost like it wanted to be breached. Inside was not just the doll, but a scrap of paper discolored by soot. "Forgive me, she wasn't supposed to die." No name, no date. She showed it to no one. Some truths she already understood were not for sharing. But questions stirred like moths under skin. That evening, while sorting through a shoebox of old letters in the attic, she discovered them. Meredith's diaries. The entries stopped in December 1949, abruptly, violently. But the final one chilled her. The fire didn't take her. It was the silence afterward that did. She couldn't sleep that night. The lullaby returned, closer now, as though sung from the other side of the wall. Downstairs, a mirror had fallen without cause. A draft that didn't feel like wind kissed the back of her neck, and the doll, stitched now, resting on the windowsill, had turned ever so slightly toward her, though no one had touched it. She visited the churchyard the next day. No headstone bore the name of a child connected to Meredith, no burial records. Only one grave looked oddly newer than it should have. No name, just a date, January 3rd, 1950. Fresh flowers rested against the stone. Daffodils. Out of season. She turned, and found Miss Pembroke watching her, the retired headmistress, now brittle with age but sharp as ever. "She used to sing to a little girl," she said, before Eliza could speak. "Meredith, I mean. People said she was mad, that the war had broken her mind. But I remember the child too." "You're not wrong." When Eliza asked where the girl went, Miss Pembroke only looked toward the hills. "Some questions come late for a reason. We stopped asking because the answers stopped coming." But Eliza was not made for silence. She returned to the house and began digging, literally. Beneath the rosebush that hadn't bloomed in decades, she found it, a box, leather split with time, its clasp tarnished. Inside, a lock of blonde hair, a child's bracelet with faded beads, and a small charred shoe. She fell to her knees, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming sense of something long dead finally drawing breath. That night, she dreamed of smoke. A small girl's hand pounding behind brick. Meredith screaming, and fire licking the wallpaper. She woke sobbing. She didn't tell the others. She packed her case in the morning. As she waited at the gate for the bus, the doll wrapped gently in her shawl, Miss Pembroke approached one last time. You found more than you thought, she said. Eliza nodded. She must have loved me, she whispered. To leave something behind. She did, came the reply. And you gave it a place to land. The bus arrived with a soft sigh of brakes. As Eliza stepped aboard, she looked back. The house seemed smaller now. Not just from distance, but because the weight it once carried had shifted. The next Sunday, as bells echoed across the quiet rooftops, Miss Pembroke sat by her window, a cup of tea steaming beside her. She wasn't thinking of guilt or justice. She thought of time, and how it preserves what people try so desperately to forget. Some secrets, she mused, are like ash in a long cold fire, waiting only for breath to stir them. She looked toward Bramblewick, where the curtains fluttered gently though no wind blew. The chimney too released a thread of smoke. Not wood smoke. Not today. Something older. More sorrowful. Some partings are not endings, she thought. They are doorways, opened with trembling hands. And some ghosts do not seek revenge. Only remembrance. Eliza did not uncover a murderer. She uncovered something far more fragile. A child forgotten. A love denied. And a grief buried not beneath soil, but under decades of silence. In restoring the doll, in holding it close, she had honored what others had refused to name. And in doing so, reminded the village, however quietly, that not all sins are punished by law. Some are healed only by being seen. Her footsteps faded, but their echo remained. The wind carried it down the lanes, over the gravestones, and through the keyholes of locked rooms. A breath, long held, finally released. Sometimes, the heaviest weight we carry is not guilt, but silence. The things we chose not to say, the letters we never sent, the truths we sealed away beneath layers of propriety, shame or protection masquerading as love. So let me ask you, now that the dust has finally begun to settle, and the echoes of footsteps long gone still seem to whisper beneath the floorboards of Briar Hollow, what would you have done? If you were in Clara Hemsley's place, staring at the key hidden for 40 years in the false bottom of a music box, fingers trembling with age but memory sharp as ever, would you have dared open the trunk that held the remnants of a life lost in scandal and secrecy? Would you have read the letter written in desperation, stained not with ink alone but with fear, a letter that could dismantle legacies and redefine names? Or would you have let it lie untouched, trusting that some truths, like old graves, should remain undisturbed? And if you were in Eleanor's shoes, condemned not by her own choices but by the silence of others, would you have forgiven those who knew and said nothing, those who smiled at you every day, sipping tea with trembling hands, while your life quietly unraveled at their convenience? And Sir Alton, does the remorse of a dying man outweigh the choices of his younger self? Can one final act of revelation cleanse the sins of decades? Or does too late honesty still carry the stain of cowardice? These are not questions with easy answers, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps mystery is not about clean resolutions, but about sitting in the discomfort of ambiguity, about recognizing that sometimes the crime is not an act but an omission, a silence so loud it deafens generations. If this tale of layered deception, of grief tightly stitched behind social grace, moved something quiet within you, even if only for a moment, we would love to hear your thoughts below. Share your version of the truth. Tell us, would you have confronted the past, or preserved the present? Would you have sought justice or peace? Your reflections not only enrich the story but help fellow mystery lovers like you discover this quiet corner, where we honor not just the solving of puzzles, but the untying of emotional knots. And if this slow unraveling, this gentle peeling back of years and layers, stayed with you, if Clara's quiet strength, or Eleanor's unspoken suffering, or even the rustle of papers in the drawer, no one dared open, sent a chill down your spine, then like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves their mysteries whispered, not shouted. We have more secrets waiting, some buried in journals, others wrapped in baby linen, one perhaps carved faintly into the underside of a windowsill, where no one ever looked. Together we'll keep seeking them out, not to judge, but to understand. Because in these hushed corners of forgotten rooms, justice doesn't always wear a badge or bang a gavel. Sometimes it sits in silence, waiting for the right person to listen. So until the next shadow shifts, the next envelope is unsealed, the next whisper catches on the breeze, keep your tea warm, your lights low, and your curiosity just a little sharper than your fear. Because stories like these don't end. They linger, like perfume in an old scarf, like warmth in a chair long after someone's left. And remember, some mysteries don't scream to be solved. They sigh, long, low, and late, like a truth that's waited too long to be heard, but never once forgot how to speak.